Sunday school leaders, my apologies for last week's video. Not only did I get it out late on Saturday morning, when I initially published it, I published it with the status of unlisted, which means if I didn't send you an email with that link, you didn't know how to get to it. And so I changed that this morning. Of course, it's after the fact, on Monday morning after Sunday's lesson. So anyway, my apologies for that. This coming Sunday, we're in the last lesson of the quarter, and it's a special focus lesson. It doesn't have its own unit. It's a special focus lesson, and the lesson is called Love Gets Involved. It's out of Luke chapter 10, verses 25 through 37, and the point of the lesson is that love for God includes costly love for others. Now, this is the very familiar parable, the very familiar story of the Good Samaritan. In fact, that term Good Samaritan, we still have that in our modern vocabulary, which indicates, of course, a person who goes out of their way to do something nice or something kind for someone, especially when they're in need. I believe this is a good follow-up to last week's lesson on being generous. Last week we looked at being generous and how that is costly with our dollars. Now today, this coming Sunday, we'll be looking at being generous with other things, with other resources, with our time, and how that can be costly as well. Now, as you get into the lesson, as you begin, it might be good to ask the class exactly what is a parable. And I'm sure somebody in the class will come up with that stock answer that we've heard over the years, and it's a good answer, and that is, it's an earthly story with a heavenly meaning. If you want to throw a little language background into your lesson, you can tell them that that word parable is the same, where we get that word parable is the same Greek word where we get the word parabola in mathematics. And it literally means to throw alongside. So this is a story that is thrown alongside to make a point. It's basically an illustration, is what a parable is. Now we start off the parable in a very familiar story, but and probably most of your class is going to know this, but there's probably some nuggets that we can glean out of this. Anyway, the lesson starts off, the text starts off with an expert in the law asking Jesus a question to test him. And he asked the question, what must I do to inherit eternal life? And Jesus answered his question with a question. And he said, well, what does the law say? How do you read it? The expert in the law replies, basically, to love God with your whole being and love your neighbor as yourself. Now, of course, the loving God with your whole being comes out of Deuteronomy chapter 6, verse 5. You know, it's also the first four parts of the Ten Commandments have to do with loving and respecting and obeying God. And then to love others as yourself, that comes right out of Leviticus 19, verse 18. And if you think about the Ten Commandments, the last six have to do with how our relationship with other people. So Jesus says, great, do this. And then the expert in the law pulls some legalese and to actually define who is my neighbor. Tell me, Jesus, who is my neighbor? Whom do I have to love? Whom can I disregard? Scripture tells us that he did this to justify himself. He thinks he's doing right. He is thinking, have I missed anyone? You know, I'm a lawyer. I want to make sure I obey the letter of the law. And that's when Jesus begins the parable. He talks about a man going down from Jerusalem to Jericho. As we look at this map, we can see that Jerusalem is southwest of Jericho. Now, if we're looking at a map like this, we might say we're going to go over to Jericho, or maybe even go up to Jericho. But why would he say going down? Well, that's literally because in elevation, they're going down. Let's look at this other map that gives you a little better illustration of the elevation difference. See, Jerusalem is about 2,500 feet above sea level. Jericho is about 800 feet below sea level, so you're looking at a 3,300 foot drop in elevation, and that's over a course of about 20 miles. So that's a pretty big decrease in elevation. So a man's walking along the road, and he gets jumped by robbers, and he's left for dead. Along comes a priest, walks on the other side of the road. Along comes a Levite, walks on the other side of the road. And I've heard sermons, I remember sermons as a child and teenager about the speculation of why the priest walked on the side and why the Levite walked on the side, because they were in a hurry to get to the temple or whatever. Well, let's just remember that this is a parable. It's not necessarily a factual story, so let's not put in too much speculation into that. Now, some may say, no, wait a minute, isn't a priest and a Levite the same thing? And here again, there's another good point for clarification. And the answer is, well, not really. Priests were from the tribe of Levi, so all priests were Levites, but not all Levites were priests. It's kind of like saying all citizens of Little Rock are Arkansans, but not all Arkansans are citizens of Little Rock. Okay, one's a subset of the other. All right, so two guys walk on the other side, pretend like they don't see him. Then along comes the Samaritan. It's good to remind your class, who are these Samaritans? Well, you can look in some commentaries and find out some more detail here, but actually, basically what they are here are half-breed Jews. Okay, they're Jews whose ancestors had been carted off in captivity, interbred, and then relocated back here in this area that's called Samaria. Now, real pure-blooded Jews despised the Samaritans. As we look at this other map, we can see that Samaria is right in the middle. Here, it's right between Galilee in the north and Judea in the south. And if Jews were traveling from one area to the other, let's say they're going from Jerusalem up to Galilee, the Jews would rather cross the Jordan River, go up the east side of the Jordan, and then cross back over, as opposed to going through Samaria, thinking that they might become unclean, and they just hated the Samaritans as well. Now, in John chapter 4, verse 3, the Bible tells us that Jesus was in the southern part, he was in Judea, and he was needing to go to Galilee. And then in verse 4, we see that he said, I have to go through Samaria. Now, if you remember the story after that, that's where he met the woman at the well, the Samaritan woman, and had that conversation. Now, I'm sure his disciples were very surprised at having to go straight through Samaria instead of going around the other way. But Jesus, of course, showed them why as he met that woman and brought her to a saving knowledge of him. Now, the Good Samaritan demonstrated that love can be costly and even risky. We see this, first of all, because he stopped and helped the guy. This road from Jerusalem down to Jericho was known for having bandits alongside of the road. So this could have been a trap. This could have been a guy who was faking being beaten up, and there could have been bandits over on in the trees on the side of the road waiting to jump this guy. But he took a risk and stopped and helped him. He also took the time to attend to his wounds. He took from his own supplies. Now, he didn't want to linger on the road, of course, because of the robbers. So he's taken into account all these things and still risking his time and actually his life, and using his supplies as he ministers and helps this guy. It's also costly in a monetary sense, because he paid for this guy's lodging, paid for him to help him to get better. And then he also offered that he would come back and reimburse the innkeeper for any additional expenses that the guy who was beaten up might incur. Now, the Samaritan showed us that being neighborly just doesn't mean being nice to the one next door. It also means loving someone who hates you. And that's a very difficult thing to do, isn't it? We remember the stories, how the Jews hated the Samaritans. The Samaritan stopped, and by implication of the story here, because the guy's going from Jerusalem to Jericho, we're assuming that this guy is Jewish, and so the Samaritan who is hated stops and helps this guy. So it's helping those people, it's loving those people who hate us. And as we think about in our current situation, in world global things that are going on, the amount of people who hate the United States or hate Americans, and we're still called to love them. That's difficult to put into action, isn't it? Let's remember at the end of Matthew 5, what did Jesus say? And this is a lesson that we had probably 5 or 6 months ago as we were studying Sermon on the Mount. You've heard it said, love your neighbor and hate your enemy, but I say to you, love your enemies, pray for them. Just don't show the ones who love you, don't just show them love. Just don't greet your own people. Just don't greet people of your own race. Just don't greet the Jewish people. Love is inclusive. Now, this parable also teaches us that love for others is not only costly monetarily, but it also involves getting our hands dirty. It involves getting personally involved, taking risks. That's what the Good Samaritan did. And we, like the expert in the law, should go and do likewise. Next time we're in not only a new quarter, we're in a new unit as well. We'll be looking at a unit called Unvarnished Truth, looking at life's greatest story. And after 6 weeks, your students will be able to take the 6 lessons that they've learned and actually walk through a gospel presentation. So it's kind of a sneaky way to teach evangelism. So you don't have to tell them that, but I'm going to tell you that. Well, that's all I have for this week. Hope you have a great week, and prepare early for your class and pray for them as well.